I see that the clock has turned to 6, so let's get started. I want to begin with a word of prayer, so please bow with me. Our gracious Father, again, we thank you for the opportunity that you've given us to gather together, to open your word, and to learn just a little bit about the research that's taking place in countries far off that shed light upon your word. So teach us during this moment. Help us to grow in our faith, our trust in you. And Lord, also I just ask that you administer to whatever needs we have as we gather together. These needs may be unspoken, but yet you know them, Lord. And we just ask that you honor those needs in the name of Christ our Lord. Amen. Okay, as I mentioned last week, and as you can see from the projection, today we want to talk about the Exodus, and we want to talk about Egypt, and also about people called the Hatti. Okay, you probably don't know much about the Hatti, but we'll talk about them a little bit later on. Okay, we've mentioned this before, but there are many people who have criticized the Bible, do not believe that the Bible is historical, that a lot of the details, the information that we have in the scriptures just doesn't square with what has happened in the past. And that's where I think archaeology helps us out. Archaeology isn't going to be able to fill in all of the details, isn't going to corroborate and substantiate all the information we have in Scripture. That's asking far too much, okay? But there are points in time where we have information that illuminates the Scriptures and helps us to understand that the Scriptures are, in fact, trustworthy. And that's one of the reasons why we can place our faith in those scriptures. So today we want to talk about just a couple of those issues that relate to the end of the Old Testament, I should say the end of the book of Genesis and the book of Exodus. So the question, okay, were the Hebrew people ever enslaved in Egypt? Now there are some scholars, I might say many scholars, who doubt that the Hebrew people were ever enslaved in Egypt. The reason for that is the lack of evidence. Archaeologically, we don't have any concrete evidence that the Hebrew people were in Egypt. Or do we? Okay. Now, we don't have, Joseph, graffiti, I was here. Even if we did have some kind of an inscription that says Joseph, I was here. Which Joseph? Joseph, a common name. But we do have some evidence that gives us reason to believe that the stories that we read about at the end of Genesis, the beginning of Exodus, is trustworthy. So if we go to Egypt, I've been to Egypt several times, we can go to a cluster of tombs at a site called Beni Hassan, okay? And in tomb 3, we have the tomb of Khnumhotep II. Khnumhotep was never a pharaoh, but he was an important official, a powerful Egyptian official. And of course, what we have depicted on the walls of his tomb, we see Asiatic or perhaps Semitic herdsmen arriving in Egypt. So if you look at that middle panel, okay, you can see people in striped, multicolored garments migrating and coming to Egypt. Now, some people have drawn that middle panel so it's a little more clear here, okay? These were people migrating, and they were led by a person by the name of Abisha, who is described as a Hyksos. Now, who are the Hyksos people? Well, we know that the Hyksos people actually took over the land of Egypt during what is called the Second Intermediate Period. That would be between the years 1650 and 1550, at which time the Hyksos were expelled from Egypt. The term Hyksos, what does it mean? Okay, Josephus, now many of you are familiar with Josephus. Josephus is the Jewish historian who lived during the first century, and he wrote a volume, actually it's several books, called The Antiquities of the Jews. And here he goes back and traces Jewish history from its beginnings. And Josephus claims that the Hyksos, that term, should be translated as shepherd kings. Okay? And he identifies the Hyksos with the Jews. So, if this panel that we have at Beni Hassan depicts the Hyksos people as it claims it does, and if the Hyksos are to be identified with the Jewish people, then we have evidence of Jewish people being in Egypt back in the, 19th century BC. And I might also add, some people squabble about the Hyksos. They say, no, that identification cannot be confirmed. But yet, Josephus claims that that's who these people were. Okay, now we also have, recently discovered, a papyrus manuscript in the Brooklyn Museum in New York. Okay, this is Brooklyn Papyrus number 35. This dates to the 17th century BC. And what we have in this papyrus is a list of 95 slaves, most of whom were females, and they were serving on a Middle Kingdom estate. About 30 of these slaves have Semitic names. And among those 30 Semitic names, around 10 of them have specifically Hebrew names. So I list a few of them here, okay? Menahemah, that's a feminine form of the name Menahem, which occurs several times in the Old Testament. That's a Hebrew name. One of the kings was named Menahem. Asherah, again, that's a feminine form of the Hebrew name Asher. Many of you probably recognize Asher. Asher was one of the 12 tribes of Israel, one of the sons of Joseph, or Jacob, I should say. Shiphrah, again, a female name. This name is mentioned in Exodus chapter 1, verse 15. Yaakobah, feminine form of Jacob. You're familiar with Jacob, of course. Sisera, feminine form of Issachar. Again, Genesis. And then Hebrew. Translated simply means Hebrew. And we see this, of course, mentioned in Genesis chapter 39. So this is a picture of that manuscript that you can see in the Brooklyn Museum. This came from Thebes, which is Luxor in lower parts of Egypt. It's in the hieratic script, so it's not your typical, what you see is hieroglyphics. It's also not the Demotic script, because later on time, alphabets change. Of course, you probably know that already, but the hieroglyphic script eventually was written in a Demotic script, which later was written in a Coptic script, which is the Greek alphabet. And of course, this is one of those transition forms in the Hebrew alphabet. But this is the manuscript that mentions all these Jewish people. Okay. Now also, just so happens that if we go to Thebes, the same place that we're talking about, Valley of the Kings, okay, we have a cluster of tombs in what is called the Valley of the Nobles, okay? And Rachmir, okay, has a tomb there. He was an important official, and he includes on the walls of his tomb, okay, depictions of Asiatics. Okay, people who have come from Asia, not Egypt, making bricks for the workshops of the Karnak temple. The Karnak temple was massive, huge, beautiful temple. Okay? And this is what we read, of course, in Exodus, that the Jewish people were enslaved and were given the task of making bricks. And of course, as Ramses became even more harsh, making bricks even without straw, okay? And so the inscription here says that there are workmen who are described as prisoners of war from Nubia and Syro-Palestine. That would be the Palestine that we know today. And so this is that section of the tomb, and you can see just next to that square piece, okay, the decorated square piece, if you look off onto the right-hand side, you see people who are described as Asiatics. That is people who come from Syro-Palestine. And you can see the individual that's up in the upper part of, let me just zoom in here, okay. This dude right here is making bricks. He's pressing the mud into the form to make bricks. And of course, he's got his associates there doing other tasks as slaves in Egypt. Now, many of these bricks have been discovered. You can see some of these bricks in the University of Pennsylvania Museum. This picture actually comes from the University of Chicago. University of Chicago has an outstanding museum. It's called the Oriental Institute Museum. Any of you ever gone up there to? Okay, hey, terrific, that's good. It's an excellent museum. It's not particularly large, you know, but it's got some really good artifacts. And what we see here is a mud brick. If you look at the mud brick itself, it's got straw in it. And then the top of the mud brick also has what is called a cartouche. A cartouche is a kind of an obelisk, not an obelisk, an oblong-shaped object with hieroglyphics inside, which is the name of an individual. Okay? And this name on this cartouche is Ramses II. Ramses II, of course, was the king, or the pharaoh, I should say, around 1250 BC. Many scholars believe that Ramses II was the pharaoh of the Exodus. And so we have this, and many other, like I say, mud bricks that you can see. Now we also have another piece from Egypt. This is down in Soleb, Nubia, which is actually part of northern Sudan today. It's not even in Egypt, really, it's in Sudan. But this is a column, and on the column you have depicted many people who have been captured and enslaved as a consequence of, well, sometimes war, sometimes just people who have migrated and who are now enslaved. And you can see a person depicted. This is how Jews are commonly depicted, okay, with a very pointed beard, as you can see, and then you see a cartouche also on this individual. Now, the cartouche describes this person as a person from the land of Shashu, okay, a worshiper of Yahweh. Yahweh, of course, most of you recognize is the Hebrew name of the Jewish God. Okay, sometimes people translate it and say Jehovah. Actually, most scholars believe it was pronounced as Yahweh. This is at the temple of Amun-Ra, which was constructed by Amenhotep III near the end of the 15th century BC. This is another picture. I got this from the internet, in fact. And it's one of the oldest extra-biblical references to that name, Yahweh, and describes some of the things that I've already said. The land of the Shashu, which could be translated as nomads. Now, also, I want you to notice that name, Shashu, because we're going to talk about the Shashu a little bit later. We're going to see another visual image of the Shashu. So, again, evidence of the fact that anybody described as a worshiper of Yahweh, okay, we're talking about somebody who's worshiping at least the Jewish God, even if it's not a Jew who's doing so. At the University of Pennsylvania, we have this stone panel depicting an Egyptian that actually happens to be Ramses with a club. The club is largely missing, but you can see that he's got a slave seized by the hair. Once again, you can see the depiction of the slave. He's got that pointed beard, and of course, he's kind of bracing himself for the blow. And again, this seems to be related to what we read about in the book of Exodus, about how Hebrew people were enslaved, were beaten. Of course, you know the story of Moses himself. Moses saw some of his kinsmen being beaten. What did he do? He rose up and killed the person who was beating the Jew, and as a consequence, Moses then fled to the land of Midian, only later return when God commanded him to come and to bring his people out of Egypt. So again, we have a depiction. And then once again, this is on the temple of Karnak in Thebes. Okay. Once again, we see Ramses II with the club. Once again, that panel of that club is missing. And here you see a cluster of people, not just one, with the pointing beard. Okay. And he's got them all by the hair. And he's clubbing them. You'll notice also the people have hands lifted up, arms lifted up. Mercy, please, mercy. Okay? Once again, the conclusion to be drawn from this and many other panels is simply that there is, at least in my mind, ample evidence of the fact that the Jews were, in fact, in Egypt. Okay? And were mistreated and treated as slaves. Now, some of our minimalists, we've talked about minimalists before, okay? These are people who are highly critical of the historicity of the scriptures, Old Testament in particular. They want something more, okay? For me, this is enough to tell me that the scriptures are accurate, okay? Okay, so we can establish then, hopefully, that Israel was in Egypt, but is there evidence of the fact that there was an actual Exodus such as described in the book of Exodus? The 9 plagues that were heaped upon the Egyptians, forcing the Pharaoh to release them, the journey to the Red Sea, where seemingly they were to be slaughtered until God split open the Red Sea. Is there evidence of that? Okay, again, many scholars question the historical accuracy not only of the Exodus, but also the way that this is described in the book of Exodus. And the reason for that is there's no archaeological evidence to support it. Well, those of you who have looked on YouTube and have gone to the internet to check this kind of stuff out, you're going to see small video clips such as you see here. The top one there, Exodus Explorers in Chariot Parts. Okay? And then the next one, the real Mount Sinai. Shocking Exodus evidence in Saudi Arabia. And then the lower one, the Exodus Explored. Chariots in coral. Have chariots been found underwater at the Red Sea? Well, these are false claims. Okay, and remember, we've talked throughout this time that we share together, that we have people who are overly eager, to use archaeology or whatever they can find, even if it's not archaeology, whatever they can find to support biblical data. Now, hats off to them in the sense that, these are Christians who want to substantiate the faith. That's good. But we can't overplay our hand, right? We've got to let the evidence speak for itself. So one of the persons who's promoting this, person I mentioned before, of course, is Ron Wyatt. He's among those who have claimed to have found chariot wheels underwater. The picture that you see up above, okay, is from the Gulf of Aqaba, which is not the Red Sea. Okay, so part of the problem with these so-called discoveries is, first of all, the wheels, and look at the top one here, the wheels are superimposed upon the coral. So if you look at that, it looks like a wheel, doesn't it? But that's superimposed upon the coral. The fact of the matter is, it's coral. There's not a wheel there at all. Okay? That I find deceptive. And then second, even if a chariot wheel is found in the Sinai desert, as has sometimes been claimed, or underwater, how do we know that it was, first of all, a chariot wheel? It could be a wagon wheel, right? And second of all, how do we know that it was from the Exodus? People have wagons, people have chariots. How can you connect that with the Exodus events? And then finally, the last thing is that the Gulf of Aqaba, where this discovery supposedly was made, is not, probably not, the place where the Exodus took place. So, we return, okay? The claim is there's no evidence to indicate that there was an Exodus. Well, in large part, that's true, okay? But it would be highly unlikely to find physical evidence of the Exodus. Now, there's several reasons for this, okay? Number one, on the walls of the Temple of Karnak, or any other temple, a pharaoh is not going to depict his failures. Kings, political leaders, even politicians today, don't talk about their failures. They sweep it under the rug, they hide it, right? That's also true for the pharaohs. They do not depict the defeats in war or any of their failures. It's all about boasting and the propaganda that goes along with that. Number two, how many artifacts would survive for 3,500 years? Not many artifacts, okay? So the chance of an artifact being discovered is not very good. And then number three, the Jewish people, as they were retreating, as they were fleeing from Egypt, are they going to leave evidence behind? Are they going to chisel on the rocks as they're making their way down the west side of the Sinai Peninsula? I was here. There's no evidence of a movement of this sort. You're not going to find garbage, litter, or anything of that sort, especially from 3,500 years ago. Okay, so one cannot expect to find anything of that sort. Does that mean that the Exodus is untrue, that it didn't happen? Oh, no. It's just that archaeology cannot give us concrete evidence to support such a thing. Now, this is a picture of Mount Sinai, I should say what is considered to be the traditional site of Mount Sinai. Today it's called Jebel Musa. It's an Arabic word. Jebel simply means mountain. Musa, not surprisingly, is of Moses, the mountain of Moses. And so according to tradition, this is where the Israeli people, the Hebrew people, came when they departed from Egypt. So the question is, did Israel encamp at Mount Sinai? And if so, where is Mount Sinai? Well, let's pull out our rusty, trusty map, okay? According to most scholars, this is the route. Tell me, is that red? Okay, the route of the Hebrew people as they fled from Egypt. Now, it is believed, and I think with good reason, that the Hebrew people, the bulk of the Hebrew people, lived in the northeast quadrant of the Nile Delta, okay? That area was called Goshen. Now, it's not the Goshen here in Indiana, okay? Actually, the Goshen in Indiana was actually named after the Goshen of where the Hebrew. So at any rate, that's where we see, again, if we're going to describe the route. The bottom line is we don't know exactly the route that was taken. Okay, I've zoomed in a little bit here, but as they fled from Goshen, they crossed over the Red Sea with the waters parting. Okay, you know the whole story. And then the Egyptian chariots and troops followed them in pursuit, and the waters covered them up, drowned them, and everything of that sort. Well, as you folks know, of course, the landscape, especially waterways, changes dramatically and significantly over time. And so this waterway probably extended, maybe not all the way to the Mediterranean, but close to it. As a matter of fact, today that waterway has been opened up with what is called the Suez Canal, okay? But somewhere, and again, we don't know exactly where, they crossed over the Red Sea, and they made their way down the west side of the Sinai Peninsula, supposedly, until they met, or I should say, arrived at Jebel Musa. Now, you'll notice that there are several yellow triangles. You see all of those? Those are mountains which people have suggested to be the mountain where the Hebrew people came. Like I say, the mountain that has received the most support, that is traditional, is Jebel Musa. But you can see in that neighborhood there are other mountains that scholars or wise guys have suggested as being the mountain. Now, if we expand this a little bit more, you can see that there's more of those yellow triangles. So there's a lot of suggestions, some of them all the way to the north of the Sinai Peninsula. Bottom line is we don't know conclusively where Mount Sinai was. But of all the choices, the one that's most plausible, the one that's most likely is Jebel Musa, okay? You may know that several of us from College Park went to Jebel Musa and climbed all the way up Jebel Musa. You can see here my two daughters on the right-hand side. They were behind me when I took this picture. And then between them, Nori Friesen. You all see Nori? Yeah, wow. I was impressed with Nori. He made it all the way to the top. Not far behind, zooming in, is that tall individual there. Who is that? That's Ramey Porter. You all see Ramey up there? I don't know what he's doing. If he's checking his phone, probably wondering why Natalie didn't follow him up there.
Well, I made it almost, but not.
Okay. All right. Natalie gave it a good sporting try. And then if you look further to the left, you can see Jason, our pastor. Do you see him sticking out there? Now, Melanie, where was Melanie? I know. I mean, I think maybe what Jason is probably covering up Melanie is what I'm guessing. I don't know for sure. Okay? And then, of course, not to be discounted is this guy. Boo! Did I scare you? I'll bet you I saw all of you jumping up out of your seat. Okay? And that's me. And in the background, you can see the mountains. There's several mountains out and around the traditional Mount Sinai, Jebel Musa. And that, of course, maybe, we don't know for sure, but maybe where the Israelites encamped. Okay? So, what I'd like to share with you is we don't have direct evidence for the Exodus, but we do have what I would call circumstantial evidence. Now, lots of times people sweep away circumstantial evidence and say circumstantial evidence is not conclusive. Well, yes and no, okay? Fingerprints at a crime scene. Fingerprints are circumstantial evidence. It's evidence of the fact that the person was there, not necessarily evidence that the person committed the crime. You follow me? And circumstantial evidence, many times in solving crimes, circumstantial evidence is the evidence that brings about a conclusion. Okay? So circumstantial evidence is not to be dismissed. So it's indirect evidence rather than direct evidence. So what is some of this evidence? Well, we have a collection of letters. This is called the Amarna letters. This is a collection of 382 clay tablets written in Akkadian cuneiform. Okay? I've described cuneiform before, and I think in some of the pictures that I showed you previously, we have cuneiform tablets. You can see several of these. There are 385 of them, or 382 of them. These were correspondence with the pharaoh Akhenaten. Okay? Akhenaten lived during the 14th century BC. Okay? Amarna, the city of Amarna, is 250 miles north of Luxor. So these shots that I showed you of the Karnak temple at Luxor, if we go 250 miles north of that, then we come to Amarna. This was built as a sometime capital of Egypt, and that's why Akhenaten was there. And of course, this is a wonderful collection of letters that have been discovered because it gives us some good information. Well, what kind of information? Well, most of these letters were diplomatic letters, correspondence between Akhenaten and his vassals, that is, some of his officials, some of the people who were conquered and were serving Akhenaten in Canaan and the Levant. Okay? And so we have this one letter written 14th century BC from Etekama, who is king of Kadesh. Okay? And he's writing to Pharaoh, and he makes this statement. Biryawaza, I like that name, Biryawaza. Maybe one of my grandchildren will be named Biryawaza sometime in the Biryawaza, king of Damascus, allowed all the cities to go over to the Habiru. But I went, and with your gods and your son leading me, I recaptured the cities from the Habiru and disbanded the Habiru. Well, who are the Habiru? Well, many scholars believe that this is a reference to the Hebrew. Okay? The semantic difference is minor. Another of the letters, Ribhaba, king of Byblos, to the king of all countries, great King Pharaoh. He's buttering him up. The war of the Habiru forces is extremely severe. Do not neglect Sumer, lest all will be joined to the Habiru. Abdihiba, who is the king of Jerusalem, Abdihiba, writing to Pharaoh. They are now attempting to take Jerusalem. Pharaoh has placed his name in Jerusalem forever. He cannot abandon the land of Jerusalem. Gezer, Ashkelon, and Lachish have given oil, food, and supplies to the Habiru. Of course, these are all Jewish cities. Jerusalem, Gezer, Ashkelon, and Lachish. And so these are peoples of those towns who perhaps are placating the Jews in hopes that they will not force them out. Could this be evidence, then, of what we read about in the book of Joshua? Joshua, of course, describes the conquest. Once the Hebrew people, were forced out of Egypt, or fled from Egypt, whatever term you want to use, they then went up into the land of Canaan and took the land of Canaan. And these letters may be evidence of that. So we've got another one, Abdihiba. Again, this is the same guy, king of Jerusalem, to Pharaoh. A town near Jerusalem has deserted. Without archers, all the king's land will be lost to the Habiru. And so these are people, this is correspondence, writing back to the Pharaoh saying, help, we're in trouble. The Habiru are conquering the land. So again, the question would be, if it's true that the Jewish people were in Egypt, and now, decades later, I shouldn't say decades, centuries later, we find the Hebrew people in Canaan, engaged in war. How do we fill in the blanks? How did they get there, if not for an exodus of some sort? Again, it's not direct evidence, but I think it's circumstantial evidence that is quite telling. Now let's go back to the Karnak temple again. This is another panel on the Karnak temple. The Karnak temple was actually constructed over a period of some 1,800 years, beginning in the 20th century BC. And we have several panels from several different pharaohs. The panel that you see at the very top here, let me just zoom in a little bit, is from Meneptah. Meneptah is the late 13th century BC. The panel is damaged, as you can see, but it depicts chariots running over Israelite people. So here's the chariot over onto the right-hand side. And as I move it over further to the left-hand side, you can see the Hebrew people being trampled asunder. Now, below this, we have another panel, again attributed to Merneptah, same period of time. And we see towers, okay? These are fortified cities. And you can see up at the top of the towers, let me zoom in case you can see that. Can you see that okay? People, again, hands lifted up, begging for mercy. They're at the top of the tower, okay? These are, again, Hebrew people who are being attacked by Merneptah, because what happened is Merneptah was the son of Ramses II. So if Ramses II was the pharaoh at the time when the Exodus took place, Merneptah followed him, okay? And what he's doing is he's then sent, okay, his chariots and his people to Israel to attack the Israeli cities. And that's what we see depicted here on the Temple of Karnak. And so here we see Israeli people begging for mercy. You can also see on the right-hand side an individual handing over a child. Perhaps if we give them our children, this will be enough, and that the Egyptians will retreat. And then, of course, down below, we see another panel with another tower. Once again, Hebrew people, Jewish people, asking for mercy. Okay? So I've got, well, just what I've told you here. Israelites depicted here being defeated by Pharaoh Merneptah during the very end of the 13th century, the military campaign. And we see also in those panels, some of those towns that we see with the towers would be identified as Ashkelon, Gezer, and Yanoam, okay, Hebrew cities at the time of the Exodus and the conquest. We have another panel, okay? This one is quite weather-beaten, as you can see, but again, you can see horses. Well, just a horse. Let me take that back. A horse, and underneath the horse, we see the Jews depicted once again. This is again a panel from the temple at Karnak of Merneptah. And here, the individuals are described as the Shashu. Remember, I asked you to remember that name, Shashu, because this is on the Soleb panel. Okay? So this, again, since we have multiple attestation of these people, Shashu, who are these Shashu people? Well, we come to understand that Shashu people are a reference to the Jewish people. So these are Hebrews, and once again, Merneptah is boasting of his attacks and conquests of the Shashu people or the Hebrew people. Now, we don't read about Merneptah conquering the Hebrew people, but we do know that during the period of the Judges, okay, the conquests and the Judges, we know that the Egyptians were making incursions into the land of Israel and were attacking the Israeli people. So it doesn't necessarily mean that they fell, but at least that we know that there was conflict. One of the most important panels that we find, this is at the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, and this is called the Merneptah Stele by the same king, Merneptah, same period of time. And the last three rows down at the very bottom make this statement: the Canaanite has been plundered. The Canaanite has been plundered into every sort of woe. Now, the Canaanite, of course, referring to the people of Canaan, which would also include the Hebrew people who have now come to occupy the land. So the Canaanite has been plundered into every sort of woe. Ashkelon has been overcome. Gezer has been captured. Yanoam is made non-existent. Israel is laid waste, and his seed is not. A little over the top. But it also makes this statement: Hati is pacified. Okay, so let's go back. Remember the title that I had? Egypt and Hatti. Who are the Hatti people? Well, the Hatti people are people from the land of the Hittites. Okay? The Hittites are mentioned 54 times in the Hebrew Bible. That's a lot. Most of you are probably not well acquainted with the Hittite people, but like I say, 54 times in the Old Testament. Prior to their discovery, if we go back to the 19th century, the Hittites were discovered in central Turkey at Boğazkale. I've been there several times. I'll show you some pictures in just a moment. But prior to their discovery, many people were questioning, what is this reference to Hittite people? We don't know anything about Hittite people. Okay? Are the authors of Scripture making this up? Who are the Hittites? Well, like I say, in the 19th century, the empire or the kingdom of the Hittites was discovered. Now, the map that you see here is what we know about the dominions of the Hittites today. Okay? The colored shade, what is the color there? Help me out. Gray? Okay, that's easy enough. Okay. The dark gray, of course, is the Hittite kingdom, and then they expanded into the lighter gray that you see out in the periphery there. These would be the vassals. These would be the lighter gray is the territory that was not directly ruled by the Hittites, but was what we call a vassal. In other words, they paid tribute. They did whatever the Hittites commanded and forced them to do. If you go all the way over, let me just show you this because it's kind of interesting. To the left-hand side, you see that site called Vilusa? Do you see that? Okay, a little closer. Vilusa, W-I-L-U-S-A. That is also called Ilios, okay? And that is the city that is described in Homer's writings with the Iliad. Okay, it's the same place. Okay, we know that the Hittites, okay, had conquered and had subjugated the people of Troy. Okay, the Hittite dominions extended, as you can see from the map here, all the way up to the north to the Black Sea, all the way to the south to the Mediterranean Sea, all the way to the left, that is to the west, the Aegean Sea, and then also all the way to the right or the east, and that is to Mesopotamia. Okay? Massive kingdom. You wonder, how is it that it took until the 19th century, the latter parts of the 19th century, for this to be discovered? Well, part of the story is Turkey. Turkey's Islamic, and Turkey has never really been interested in inviting scholars and archaeologists into their land. Until recently, that's changed now, okay? But they have never really been interested in history that precedes Islam coming into Turkey. Okay, so as a consequence, nobody really knew much about it, but eventually discoveries were made and people connected the dots, and now we know that the Hittites existed and that this was not just some mythological crazy name that the Jewish people wrote into their scriptures. This is Hattusis today. Hattusis was the capital of the Hittite Empire for most of its existence. The Hittite people, where do they occur in the Old Testament? Of course, in the book of Genesis, we know that Abraham was buried in the cave of Machpelah. You remember that? Machpelah was purchased from Ephron, the Hittite. So the Hittites had extended their influence all the way down to where Israel is today. Okay? And so Abraham purchased this tomb. It's a tomb in which he was buried. Now, Abraham's grandson, Esau, married two Hittite women. Not satisfied with one, two Hittite women. Okay? You may be more familiar with this guy, and this is Uriah. Do you know who Uriah was? Uriah was a Hittite. And of course, he was serving in David's army out there fighting. Okay? And of course, this is the time when David, of course, had illicit relations with Uriah's wife. She became pregnant. In order to try and cover up the sin, he effectively had Uriah killed. And then he married Uriah's widow, Bathsheba. Okay? But Uriah was a Hittite. So again, we see many Hittites throughout the Old Testament scriptures. Solomon, you're familiar with Solomon. Solomon had hundreds of wives. And okay, among the many wives of Solomon, he had Hittite wives as well. So this is not, a people group that is insignificant in the Old Testament. We read about them in several instances. Again, Hattusis, the capital, is in central Turkey, a very mountainous region. The area is really quite beautiful and quite scenic. And of course, archaeologists have gone in once it was discovered, have excavated. This was the palace complex. You can see that all that remains is really the stone. Perhaps the superstructure was constructed of wood. That's not going to survive for, well, as many as 3,700 years ago. But you do see the remains. Down below, this is located on a high elevated place. Down below, you can see walls of the lower city. In the upper city, you can see the remains of walls. This is called the Lion Gate. You can see lions depicted as an entryway. So even if Hattusis is attacked, you can see that it's well fortified. The Hittite Empire lasted from around 1700 BC to around 1190 BC. Once the empire collapsed, it really fragmented. It didn't entirely collapse. We get into what is called the Neo-Hittite kingdoms, and they went from around 1180 BC to 700 BC. So we're talking about a period of approximately 1,000 years where Israel's neighbors to the north were Hittites. That's one of the reasons why we see the Hittites and the Israelites bumping into one another frequently. These are steps leading to the top of the rampart wall at Hattusis. If you look at museums in Turkey, today, Turkey's museums are loaded with Hittite ruins and remains. Remember, we're not finding these things just at Hattusis, at the capital city. These ruins were found all over Turkey. And so you can see just a few of these examples. So if you go to Istanbul at any point, I think the biggest attraction there is the Istanbul Archaeological Museum. You can see many of the Hittite remains there with a lot of other very important biblical artifacts that we'll talk about a little bit later in our lectures. Also, if you go to Ankara, the capital city of Turkey today, the Museum of Anatolian Civilizations, a big museum, very big, again contains many of the Hittite remains. This is a depiction of a Hittite chariot with a bowman, a driver, and again, you can see that the conquered territories, their opponents, are trampled underfoot of the horses. Very similar to the depictions, the way that we've seen even at the Temple of Karnak, where we see conquered peoples under the feet of the horses. This was discovered at Carchemish. Carchemish is located in southeastern Turkey. Carchemish is actually on the border of Syria. But Carchemish, again, a very important ancient city. This is likewise from Carchemish, again, a Hittite panel relief carving. This is a scene from the Gilgamesh epic. Oh, remember scratch your heads. Remember the Gilgamesh epic that we were talking about previously? Okay. This is Gilgamesh and Enkidu as they kill the god of the cedar forests. His name is Humbaba. You'd have to go back and read Gilgamesh epic, which you can actually find on the internet. So read it, and this is the killing. You can see both Enkidu and Gilgamesh with knives poking him down, stabbing him in the head. Whew. Too violent. Among those artifacts discovered is the diadem of a Hittite king. We don't know the name of the Hittite king whose diadem this was. If we go not far from Hattushas, we see the main sanctuary. This is the primary place of worship for the Hittite people. This is a place called Yazalikaya. Okay? And what we see here are thousands of gods that are cut in relief on the hills and the mountains of Yazalikaya. This one here is a depiction of Tudhaliya the fourth. He's holding up the goddess Shumara. But again, I can show you a lot of pictures, really a fascinating, interesting place at Yazalikaya. Not far to the north, we have an earlier capital for a shorter period of time it's called Alchahoyuk, okay? And what's interesting here at Alchahoyuk, of course, you see this is the entry into the city. You can see that it's guarded by two sphinx. Where do we know the sphinx from? Egypt, right? So this tells you that during this period of time, there's contact with the Egyptians, okay? And again, Alchahoyuk, many ruins there, many very interesting features as well. Now, this is a map. It's in German, as you can see, that talk about the dominant kingdoms or empires during this would be the 13th century BC, okay? Is that purple up at the top? What? Up at the top here it says, Rik der Hithlitier. It's blue. Last time I guessed blue and it was purple. Okay, whatever. Okay, that's blue, okay? That's the Hittite Empire, of course, during the 13th century BC. And then down below, I'm not even going to guess what that is. What color is that? What? Yellow? Okay. That looks to be the same as the Assyrian Empire. Is that the same color too? Very close. Okay, whatever. At any rate, the point that I want to make is that this is where we have two kingdoms clashing with one another. The Hittite kingdom during the zenith of its power, okay, and then also the kingdom of Egypt, okay, during the time of Ramses II. Okay, what happened is the Egyptians pushed further north, conquered, okay, all of Israel during this period of time. This is prior to the Exodus, incidentally, okay? This just shows how powerful Ramses and the Egyptians were at this time. And then, of course, the Hittites are coming down south. Nobody's interested in the Saudi desert, of course, because there's nothing there. You can't survive in the Saudi desert. That's one of the reasons why you're probably wondering, why don't they take that land? Well, sure, you can have all of it you want. There's no water there, okay? So what happened is, during the time of Mu'atili II, Mu'atili, of course, was one of the Hittite kings at this time. He was pressing further south, and he came up against Ramses II. And they engaged in a huge, massive battle at the Orontes River. Okay? This was called Kadesh at the time. Okay? Eventually, what they did is they realized that none of us is getting anywhere. Okay? Doesn't make any sense for us to continue to fight and to kill off our soldiers. So they came and established what is called the earliest known parity treaty. A parity treaty is a treaty where both parties recognize the other as an equal. Okay? This is depicted on the walls of the Karnak temple. Okay, so you can see that today if you go to Egypt. But also we have a cuneiform Hittite inscription of this. Again, you can see that it's damaged significantly. Okay, and this is the Hittite copy of this treaty. not to leave the ladies out of it, okay? After the dust had settled, peace is established, everything south of the Orontes River is the dominion of the Egyptians. Everything north of the Orontes River. Incidentally, the Orontes River, this site today, or actually I shouldn't say today, back in Paul's day is called Antioch, Syrian Antioch. This is the same site. Today it's also known as Antakya. That's where the earthquakes had taken place. That's where this battle took place. Okay, a few years, about 30, 40 years after this, after the dust had settled, the Egyptian queen Nepthera, wife of Ramses II, wrote to Queen Pudhepa, who is Hattushili III's wife, okay? And this is a friendship letter, okay? Sending gifts, and of course reciprocated also by gifts being sent from Hattushis to Egypt. Basically saying, okay, we're at peace now, okay? You control your area, we got our area. But again, interesting correspondence that we read. Okay, let's wrap this up. I notice that we've only got 4 minutes before we arrive at 7 o'clock. But the point that I'm trying to make is archaeology, and I've made this statement many times already in our previous discussions, archaeology cannot prove everything in the Bible. Not everything is provable, okay? There's not going to be solid evidence for actions in particular, okay? So, absence of solid evidence, and this is one of the things that the minimalists emphasize. You can't trust the Bible, but the absence of solid evidence indicates that it didn't happen, okay? But what I would say is the absence of solid evidence is not solid evidence of absence, okay? And for the reasons that I've already described, not everything's going to survive. Maybe you're looking in the wrong place, okay? So, to summarize, nobody today doubts the existence of the Hittites, yet many people still question facts of the Bible. And like I say, there are still people who question whether or not Israel was ever in Egypt, and they question whether or not there was an Exodus, and some of them question whether or not there was a conquest as well. Questions that you might have.
There was one slide where it showed a number of...
Yes, that is Ramey.
What?
That is Ramey.
Oh, I know. He's hard to miss.
Yeah, I thought you were asking about that slide.
No, there was one where you were showing temple reliefs, a wall, and there were a number of vertical pits
Right.
on the surface. Could you explain what those are?
Yeah, that's damage. Most of the walls at Karnak are in good shape. Maybe I can go back quickly to see. Oh, this is it right here. Right there?
Yes, that's it.
Yeah, that's damage due to wind, rain. You don't get much frost in Egypt, so that's not it, but that's damage.
I heard a different story when we were there.
Oh, yeah?
That local people still worship the ancient gods, and sometimes they come and they scrape away bits of the stone to use in their potions.
Yeah, they would have to have a step ladder to reach this. So, does that never happen? I don't know. Maybe it is. Was our guide the one who told you this?
I think so, yeah.
Okay. All right. Yeah, they would need a step ladder to do that. So that's going to extremes. And if so, you'd expect the lower panels also to be have this damage as well.
There were places where they were all over different heights.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay. Sorry for you folks that are online. I don't want to ignore you, but the question was, this slide that I'm showing right now, our guide while we were in Egypt a year and a half ago had said that the damage is due to people who are scraping off part of the temple walls because they considered it a sacred place and wanted to take it home. And my response to that is, well, they want to climb that or stick a ladder up there to dig it out. I just don't find that convincing. Other questions?
The capital of the Hittite Empire that you showed, how large, I had a hard time understanding the scale of I guess it was the palace.
Mm-hmm.
How large was that we were looking at?
We're talking about an extensive city for Hattusha. I've been there, and to get to all the different gates, I showed you the Lion Gate. There's also a Sphinx Gate and another gate. There's also the rampart with the steps. I could have walked it easily, but actually I drove around to get to some of the different parts. So it's extensive enough, large enough that it wasn't a small little city or village. It was something much larger than that. Also bear in mind that much of the city would probably spill out beyond the walls, as was typical and common for ancient cities. So if the city were attacked, the people would then, who are outside of the city walls, would flee inside of the city walls for protection. Those structures that are outside of the city walls are built with less durable materials, probably wood, which won't survive for 3,500 years, 3,700 years, or mud. So what we've got are the more durable materials, which you see in this photograph. These are the stone pieces of the foundations.
So one of the clips you showed was on YouTube, was that Pattern of Evidence series.
Okay.
He's put out 4 feature-length films on that. And is any of that considered to be factual, or is he just taking evidence and made it fit his theory?
Okay. Dawn asks the question, one of the slides that I showed that's on the YouTube, okay, the YouTube slide that I put up, is from the series called Patterns of Evidence. And he's wondering if those are legitimate or not. And I've got to say, I've never seen the films Patterns of Evidence, so I don't know exactly what is in them. So I can't really comment as to, whether that's good stuff or not. I don't know. Plead ignorance.
Question about, you were at the traditional site of Saskia Mount Sinai. Is there physical evidence that there was an encampment there, or that Moses met God on the mountain, or anything like that?
Okay, the question is, although I was at Mount Sinai, incidentally, this is the first time I've ever been to Mount Sinai. So I've never been there before, so the climb and everything was new to me. But the question is there any physical evidence of an encampment there? And the answer to that is no. But the Hebrew people were transient people who lived in tents. So they're not going to establish permanent dwellings or stone dwellings, things that would survive for that period of time. Today, at the foot of Mount Sinai, there is St. Catherine's Monastery. So an early Christian monastery was constructed there, which actually was where one of our most important New Testament manuscripts was found, at that monastery. So it's a very, very significant place. And the reason why that monastery was established there during the Byzantine period is because those Christians believed that Jebel Musa, that mountain, was the place. But like I say, we don't have any evidence of an Israeli encampment at that site.
So is there anything now in that area of that Hittite capital from back then? Would they continue building near the site, within the site, or is it all abandoned?
Well, today there's a nearby town called Boaz Kali, okay? And they've got a small museum with some artifacts that were discovered at Hattusha. So it's not like the Turkish people have moved elsewhere. There are towns and villages, small places, sprinkled throughout the countryside in Turkey. And Boaz Kali is the one that's located closest to Hattusha. Hattusha is actually located I'm going to guess here, probably 150, maybe 200 miles to the east of Ankara. So if you get a chance to go to Ankara, rent your car and go see the place. It's worth it.
I've seen articles or videos in the last couple of years of some archaeologists that believe they may have found Joseph's palace with 12 columns and 12 tombs, all of them being Asiatic except one. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Okay, the question is, there is, I don't know if it's an internet site or a video or something of that sort, supposedly of Joseph's palace being discovered in Egypt. I am totally unaware of that. So if you've got a website or a video or something of that sort that you can show me, supposedly you said that this came from an archaeologist?
Yeah, in digs they found a palace in the land where they believe the Israelites settled, and it's got 12 columns specifically, and they found 12 tombs surrounding it.
Wow.
One of them built the shape of a pyramid, where the other 11 are Asiatic. So
Yeah, supposedly this is 12 columns representing the 12 tribes and 12 tombs. To me, that, immediately kind of raises my suspicions as to thinking that's bogus. But I can't say for sure. Send me information. Let me see what you got, if you can find it. Okay, once again, thank you for coming. I know that this is, for many of you, some of you I know have come because you have kids that will come to kids' night here also at the church. And I know this is a good crowd, actually, for the fact that we have no kids. So you came out on your own initiative because you wanted to be here. And thank you for doing so. We'll see you next week.